What if the person God chose to show you what real love looks like was the last person on earth you would ever trust? Two religious men walked past a dying stranger. One mechanic stopped. And what happened next didn't just save one life. It rewrote everything three men believed about God, love, and themselves. Daniel Carter had been awake for 16 hours. His boots were heavy with dried concrete. His back ached from a full day on a Phoenix construction site. His hands, calloused and cracked, gripped the steering wheel of his truck as the desert stretched out in front of him, black and endless, and completely silent. He didn't want to think. He just wanted to get home. But that was the night everything changed. Because at 9:47 on a cold Tuesday evening, on a stretch of Highway 85 that most people avoided after dark, Daniel Carter saw something in his headlights that made his stomach drop. At first, it looked like a pile of clothes beside the guardrail. He blinked. He leaned forward in his seat, and then his headlights swept over it fully, and he saw an arm, and then a leg, and then a face. There was a man lying on the side of the road. Daniel's foot eased off the gas. His heart began to beat faster. His mind started running through every possible explanation: car accident, a fall, someone asleep, but the position of the body told a different story. This wasn't someone who had chosen to rest there. This was someone who had collapsed or been left. He looked around. The highway was completely empty in both directions. No other headlights, no houses in the distance, no emergency lights, just desert, just darkness, just this one man alone, injured on the side of a road where almost nobody drove. And in that moment, Daniel Carter did something remarkable. He thought about driving past. He thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. He would tell people that later, and they would be surprised by his honesty. But those 4 seconds mattered. Because in those 4 seconds, he wrestled with every fear, every excuse, every rational argument a person could make for not stopping. And then he pulled over. He climbed out of the truck and walked toward the man, and what he saw made him stop walking for just a moment. The man's shirt was torn at the shoulder. There was blood on his face. His phone was gone, no devices, no wallet visible, no sign of who he was or where he had come from. He was somewhere in his 50s, with silver hair matted against his forehead, and when Daniel crouched down beside him, he could see the shallow rise and fall of his chest, still breathing, but barely. "Hey," Daniel said, his voice louder than he expected. "Hey, can you hear me?" The man didn't answer. "I'm calling for help. You're going to be okay." He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, and while he waited for the operator to answer, he took off his own jacket and folded it carefully, placing it beneath the man's head. It was at that moment, standing there on that dark highway, beside a stranger he had never met, that Daniel Carter heard the sound of another car approaching. He turned and looked. The headlights came slowly, and then they slowed down, and Daniel felt relief wash over him. Help! Someone else was stopping. Except they didn't stop. The car slowed, almost came to a halt, and then accelerated again, the red taillights disappearing into the darkness. Daniel stared after them. He would later find out that the driver of that first car was Pastor Michael Reynolds, a man he had actually seen speak at a community event the year before. A man known throughout the Phoenix area for his sermons about service and compassion. A man who had given talks about the Good Samaritan, the very parable of Jesus, on more than one occasion. And Pastor Reynolds had slowed down because he saw Daniel crouching in the road, and he saw the body of the man, and for one full second he had his hand on the door handle. But then he looked at the clock on his dashboard. 9:51 p.m. He had a meeting at 10:15, a board meeting at the church, an important discussion about the new community outreach program, ironically, a program designed to help vulnerable people in the Phoenix area. He told himself Daniel was already there. Daniel was already handling it. The ambulance was probably already on the way. He convinced himself that his absence wouldn't matter. And so Pastor Michael Reynolds drove away from a dying man on the side of the road so that he could make it to a meeting about helping people. 7 minutes later, a second car approached. This one also slowed. This time, the driver got all the way out. Daniel actually stood and waved. He thought for certain this person was going to walk over. But the man stopped at the edge of the headlight beam about 30 feet away and just stood there looking. His name was Dr. Stephen Miller, a successful Christian businessman, a man who had once written a check for $40,000 to a local charity, a man whose name was on the side of a children's wing at a Phoenix hospital. And Dr. Stephen Miller stood there for almost a full minute. He wasn't a bad man. He would say that to himself many times in the years that followed. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't cold. But in that moment, a thought entered his mind, and it grew until it blocked out everything else. What if this is a setup? What if the man on the ground isn't really injured? What if the moment he walked forward, someone else would jump out of the darkness? He had read about it. He had seen it on the news. People staged roadside emergencies to rob drivers who stopped. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, and the longer he stood there, the more the fear grew. And then, Dr. Stephen Miller got back into his car. He told himself he would call 911 when he had better signal. He told himself Daniel had already called. He told himself the ambulance was coming. He drove away. And Daniel Carter, 16 hours into his workday, back aching, standing alone on a desert highway at 10 o'clock at night, watched the tail lights of the second car disappear. He didn't know who those men were. He didn't know their names. He didn't know their positions or their reputations or the checks they had written. All he knew was that he was alone again. And then, third set of headlights. Old, uneven. The kind of headlights that belong to a truck that has been on the road too long and seen too many miles. Daniel raised his hand again, half expecting the same result. The truck slowed and stopped, and this time the driver didn't hesitate. The door opened immediately, and a man stepped out and walked straight toward them, with nothing in his hands and no fear on his face. His name was Marcus Williams. He was a mechanic. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Phoenix. He drove a truck with over 200,000 miles on it. He had a toolbox in the bed and jumper cables and a first aid kit he had put together himself after watching a YouTube video 3 years ago. He was not a pastor. He was not a doctor. He was not wealthy or powerful or respected in any significant circle. But when Marcus Williams saw that injured man lying on the side of the road, something happened inside him that he would later struggle to explain in words. He said it felt like recognition, like he was looking at something he already knew. "What happened?" Marcus asked, crouching down beside Daniel. I don't know. Found him like this. Ambulance is coming. Marcus nodded. He opened the first aid kit he had grabbed from his truck. His movements were calm and practiced, and Daniel watched him work with a kind of quiet focus that was almost impossible to explain. He's losing blood through that cut, Marcus said more to himself than to Daniel. Keep his head still. And then Marcus Williams did something that Daniel Carter would think about for the rest of his life. He took off his only jacket. Not to place under the man's head, Daniel had already done that. Marcus tore a strip from the inside lining and used it to apply pressure to the wound on the man's arm. Carefully, firmly, without drama, without hesitation. You didn't have to do that, Daniel said. Marcus looked up. He's bleeding, he said simply. What else would I do? Daniel didn't have an answer, because it was the simplest thing Marcus could have said, and in its simplicity, it was the most devastating question Daniel had ever been asked. What else would I do? Not, I'm brave, not I'm a good person, not I knew it was the right thing, just he's bleeding. What else would I do? They stayed there together, the construction worker and the mechanic, beside a man whose name they did not yet know. On a highway where almost nobody drove in the dark, in the cold, until the ambulance finally arrived. And when the paramedics took over and the lights began to flash and the radio crackled, and suddenly the road was full of people and activity, Marcus Williams walked back to his truck. He didn't give his name to the paramedics. He didn't wait to be thanked. He just got in his truck and he drove away. And Daniel Carter stood there on the side of that highway watching him go and felt something shift inside him, something deep, something he couldn't name right away. He would name it later. But in that moment, he just stood there, because two men who knew the words about compassion had driven away from it, and one man who had never been given much of anything had stopped and stayed and given what he had. That man on the ground, still breathing, now stabilized, being lifted onto a stretcher. His name was James Anderson, and none of them knew it yet. But what had just happened on that empty highway was not an accident. It was a mirror. And every one of them, Daniel, Marcus, James, and the two men who drove away, was about to see their own reflection, more clearly than they ever had before. James Anderson woke up in a hospital bed and didn't know where he was. That was the first thing. The disorientation, the white ceiling, the sound of machines, the dull, deep ache in his left arm that told him something had happened, something serious, before his mind had even caught up with the facts. The second thing he noticed was that he was alone, not temporarily alone, not the kind of alone where you know someone is right outside the door getting coffee and will be back in 3 minutes. He looked around that room, the chairs, the windowsill, the small table beside his bed, and there was nothing. No flowers, no card, no coat draped over a chair that belonged to someone who had been there all night. Nobody had come. He was 54 years old, and nobody had come. He stared at the ceiling for a long time after that. And a nurse came in and told him what had happened, that someone had found him on Highway 85, that 2 men had stayed with him until the ambulance arrived, that he had lost a significant amount of blood, but that he was going to be fine. "Do you know who found you?" she asked. James shook his head. "There was no ID on you when they brought you in," she said. "Do you have family we can call?" He thought about that question for longer than he should have. "I'll make the calls myself," he said finally. She nodded and left, and James Anderson lay in that hospital bed with a phone that had been recovered from the scene. Somehow it had slid under the guardrail and survived, and he scrolled through his contacts. He had 263 contacts in his phone. He called 3 of them. One didn't answer. One said they were glad he was okay and asked if he needed anything. And when he said yes, there was a pause long enough to tell him everything he needed to know. The third call went to voicemail. He put the phone down. 263 people. And at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, lying in a hospital bed after nearly bleeding out on a desert highway, James Anderson couldn't find one person willing to walk through a door for him. He had spent 30 years building something, a company, a reputation, a network of relationships built entirely on what people could get from each other. He had been the man at the center of every room. He had known governors and CEOs and pastors of megachurches. He had written checks that put his name on buildings. And right now, there was not a single flower on his windowsill. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, James Anderson, who never cried, who had trained himself out of it, somewhere in his late 30s, felt something burning behind his eyes that he couldn't stop. He didn't cry. Not yet. But it was close. And that was when the door to his room opened. He expected a doctor. He expected another nurse. He expected someone with a clipboard and a form to fill out. Instead, it was a man he had never seen before. Tall, work clothes, tired eyes, but something steady in them the way a person looks when they've learned to carry weight for a long time. "Mr. Anderson," the man said. James blinked. "Who are you?" "My name is Daniel Carter. I was the first one who found you last night." There was a silence. James looked at him for a long moment. This man who had clearly come straight from somewhere else, whose hands were rough, whose boots still had dried dust on them, and something in his chest moved in a way he wasn't prepared for. "You stayed with me," James said. "Yes, sir." "Why?" Daniel paused. It was a real pause, not a polite one, like the question had landed somewhere genuine, and he was deciding what the honest answer was. "I don't know that I had a reason," Daniel said. "You were hurt. I stopped. That's about the whole story." James nodded slowly. "The nurse said 2 men stayed." "Yes." "The other man, his name is Marcus. He's the one who really kept you stable until the ambulance came. I just made the call." "Where is he?" Daniel looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "That's actually why I came. I've been trying to find him since last night. He left before I could get his name. I only saw the back of his truck." James stared at him. "You came here to find a man you don't know so you could make sure. He got credit for helping a man you also don't know." Daniel looked almost embarrassed. "I just thought you'd want to know who saved your life." And that sentence hit James Anderson like something physical. He had spent his entire career making sure he got credit, making sure his name was attached to every deal, every donation, every success. He had fired people for taking credit that belonged to him. He had ended partnerships over recognition. And here was a construction worker, exhausted, clearly pressed for time, who had driven to a hospital to make sure someone else got the acknowledgement they deserved. "Sit down," James said. Daniel sat, and for the next hour, in a way that surprised both of them, they talked. Not about the accident, not about the logistics of what happened. They talked the way people sometimes talk, when something strips away the normal layers, honestly, directly, without performance. James told him things he hadn't said out loud in years, about building something impressive and discovering it was hollow, about a marriage that had ended 6 years ago, because, as his ex-wife had told him directly, "You are not available to anyone, James, not even yourself." About a son in college who sent obligatory texts on birthdays, about a life that looked successful from a distance and felt like standing in an empty room up close. Daniel listened. He didn't fill every silence. He didn't offer solutions. He just listened, and that James would realize later was its own kind of gift, because nobody in his professional life had ever just listened without calculating how the information might be useful. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said eventually. "Go ahead." "Do you know a man named Marcus Williams?" "No. Should I?" "He knew you. Or not you personally, but I think he knew something about where you were. He just responded to it in a way that I can't fully explain." James frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned forward. "When Marcus walked up to you before he even knew if you were alive, he didn't hesitate. And I'm telling you, I hesitated. I'm not proud of it, but I did. 4 seconds I thought about driving past. But Marcus, he got out of that truck like he was answering a call, like he had been waiting for it." James was quiet. "2 other cars passed you before either of us stopped," Daniel continued. "I found that out from the highway cameras. 2 other cars slowed down and kept going." James looked at him. "Who were they?" Daniel hesitated. "I probably shouldn't say." "Tell me." Another pause, and then Daniel said, "One of them was Pastor Michael Reynolds." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. James knew that name. Everyone in Phoenix knew that name. Michael Reynolds was one of the most respected religious voices in the city. He had spoken at James's company's annual charity dinner 2 years in a row. He had given a beautiful speech about the responsibility of the privileged to care for the vulnerable. James stared at Daniel. "Reynolds drove past me." "Yes, sir. He saw me and kept going. He slowed down, then he left." James was very still. "And the second one, Dr. Stephen Miller." James closed his eyes. Stephen Miller. He knew Stephen Miller personally. They had been in the same business circles for a decade. Stephen Miller had a reputation as a generous man, a faith-driven man, a man of principle. He had left him bleeding on a highway. "And Marcus," James said slowly. "Marcus Williams. A mechanic." "Yes, sir." "A man I've never heard of. A man with nothing to gain. He didn't even wait to be thanked," Daniel said. "He was gone before the ambulance finished loading you." James opened his eyes, and something was happening inside him, something that didn't have a name yet, but was building pressure like a sealed room filling with water. Something between fury and grief, and a kind of bewildered gratitude so unfamiliar it almost felt like pain. "Why did he do it?" James asked, not rhetorically, like he genuinely needed to understand, like it was the most important question he had ever asked. A man with nothing, why did he stop when men with everything kept going? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked at James for a moment, at this man in the hospital bed, the silver hair, the expensive watch still on his wrist, the empty chairs around him, and he said something quiet and careful. "Maybe," Daniel said, It's because he already knew what it felt like to be left. The room went silent. James didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, and his hand resting on the white blanket slowly closed into a fist, not in anger, but in the way hands close when something gets through the armor. When something true reaches the place you have spent years protecting. He looked at the ceiling again. Two men who knew the right words, two men with status and influence, and all the external markers of good character. And one mechanic who acted without hesitation, without recognition, without reward. James Anderson had spent his career studying people, figuring out their motivations, calculating their angles. And for the first time in 30 years, he had encountered a human being whose action he could not explain by any logic he had ever used. He couldn't find the angle. He couldn't find the benefit. He couldn't find the calculation. There was no calculation. That was the thing that was breaking something played inside him. Not the accident, not the blood, not even the empty chairs. It was the absence of calculation. Marcus Williams had stopped because a human being was hurt. Full stop. No further reasoning required. And James Anderson, lying in that hospital bed with 263 contacts and not one flower on his windowsill, found himself wondering, for the first time in his adult life, whether he had ever once done anything without calculating what he would get in return. Daniel stood to leave. "I'm going to keep looking for him," he said. "Marcus, I think you deserve to meet the man who saved your life." James nodded slowly, and after Daniel left the room, was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet than before. Before, the quiet had felt like emptiness. Now it felt like the moment just before something begins. Daniel found him on a Thursday afternoon. It took him 4 days. 4 days of driving around the east side of Phoenix, asking questions at auto shops, describing the old truck and the jumper cables, and the man who had moved through a crisis like he had done it 100 times before. 4 days of dead ends and wrong numbers, and people who knew a Marcus, but not the right one. And then a woman at a tire shop on McDowell Road said, "Marcus Williams." "Yeah, he works 2 blocks down, Sullivan's Auto." Daniel walked in and saw him immediately. Marcus was under the hood of a Toyota, and he didn't look up right away. He just kept working, adjusting something with a wrench, his movements the same as they had been on that highway, quiet, focused, certain. "Marcus Williams," Daniel said. Marcus looked up, and when he saw Daniel's face, something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, not surprise, exactly. Something more like a man who had been waiting for a knock at the door and had almost convinced himself it wasn't coming. "That's me," Marcus said. "You left before I could get your name," Daniel said. "That night on Highway 85. Marcus set down the wrench. He wiped his hands on a cloth and looked at Daniel with steady eyes. "Ambulance got there. You had it handled. The man you helped is alive," Daniel said. "His name is James Anderson. He wants to meet you." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He doesn't need to do that." "He says he does." "Tell him he's welcome." Marcus picked up the wrench again. "But I didn't do anything worth a meeting." Daniel stared at him. "You kept a man from bleeding out on the side of a highway." "I had a first aid kit," Marcus said simply. "He needed it. That's not a story. That's just Tuesday." And Daniel almost laughed because it was the most honest, unperformative thing he had heard anyone say in years. No false modesty, no drama. Just a man who had helped someone because he had the tools to help and therefore the responsibility to use them. Nothing more complicated than that. But Daniel had not driven across Phoenix twice to leave it there. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Marcus glanced up. "Go ahead." "Two cars passed him before we got there. You know that." A pause. "I figured." "You figured?" "People slow down," Marcus said. "They think about it. Most of them keep going. That's just how it is." "Does that make you angry?" Marcus set the wrench down again. This time he didn't pick it back up. He looked at Daniel with an expression that was hard to read at first, and then it became readable, and what was in it was not anger. What was in it was something older than anger, something that had been worn smooth by years of being pressed against it. "I grew up being the person those cars drove past," Marcus said. "Not on a highway, but in rooms, in offices, in churches even. People see you, they calculate real fast whether you're worth stopping for, and most of the time they decide you're not." He paused. "So when I saw that man on the road, I didn't see a stranger. I saw someone that the world had just decided wasn't worth stopping for. And I've been that person too many times to keep driving." The shop was quiet. Daniel stood there with that answer sitting in his chest like something heavy and necessary. And he thought about the 4 seconds. His 4 seconds of hesitation on that highway. And he understood for the first time that his hesitation and the pastor's hesitation and the doctor's hesitation all came from the same place, a calculation. A rapid, almost unconscious weighing of cost and benefit, of risk and reward, of whether the person on the ground was worth the inconvenience of stopping. Marcus hadn't made that calculation, not because he was braver, not because he was better, but because he already knew from a lifetime of experience what it felt like to be on the other side of it. He had been the person deemed not worth stopping for. So, he stopped. 3 days later, Marcus Williams walked into a hospital room and met James Anderson for the first time. James was dressed sitting in the chair by the window, preparing to be discharged. He looked different from the man on the highway, alert, composed, carrying himself with the posture of someone who had spent decades in boardrooms. But there was something different in his face, too, something that hadn't been there before. An openness, a kind of rawness around the eyes that expensive suits couldn't cover. He stood when Marcus walked in. "Marcus Williams," he said. "Mr. Anderson," Marcus said. They shook hands, and James held the handshake a beat longer than was necessary, the way people do when a handshake is trying to carry more than a handshake can carry. "Sit down, please," James said. They sat across from each other, and for a moment neither of them spoke. It was the specific silence of two people from completely different worlds who have been connected by something neither of them chose. "I need to say thank you," James said. "You don't owe me anything," Marcus said. "I owe you my life. The paramedics saved your life. I just bought them some time." James looked at him. "Why do you keep doing that?" "Doing what?" "Minimizing what you did. Every time someone credits you, you hand it to someone else." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I know what it looks like when someone does a good thing and then holds it over you. I've seen it. I've had it done to me. So I'm not interested in that." James leaned back. "Someone helped you and made you pay for it. It wasn't a question. and Marcus looked at him with an expression that confirmed it without elaborating. "Then why stop?" James asked. "Seriously, you of all people, someone who's been left by people, passed over by people, someone who had every reason to look at a stranger on a highway and say, 'That's not my problem. Why did you stop?'" Marcus thought about it, really thought about it the way he rarely let himself do out loud. "There's a passage," he said finally. Luke 10. Jesus tells a story about a man beaten on the road. Two religious men walk past. One regular guy stops. And the whole point that people miss is that Jesus doesn't tell the story to explain who qualifies as your neighbor. He tells it to show what a neighbor does. James stared at him. "People spend their whole lives asking the wrong question," Marcus continued. "They ask, 'Who deserves my help?' Like there's a checklist, like love is something you earn. But that's not what the story says. The story says a man was hurting, and one person moved toward him. That's it. That's the whole thing." The room was very still. James Anderson, a man who had given speeches, who had hired consultants to craft his public messaging, who had sat across from senators and hedge fund managers, did not have a single word, because he had heard that parable before. He had heard it in church. He had heard it in sermons. He had heard pastors build entire series around it. He had probably written a check after one of those sermons because the story had moved him in the moment. But he had never heard it said the way Marcus Williams just said it. Not as theology, not as a lesson to be studied, but as something that Marcus had decided to simply live without applause, without recognition, without even a name left behind. "You knew the story before you stopped," James said slowly. "That night, you weren't stopping because the situation made sense. You were stopping because of something you believed." "I stopped because you were bleeding," Marcus said. "But you're right that I wasn't afraid. And maybe the reason I wasn't afraid is because I stopped asking God to guarantee the outcome a long time ago. I just asked him what to do next." That sentence went through James Anderson like electricity. He had spent 30 years trying to control outcomes. Every relationship, every investment, every conversation engineered toward a predictable result. He had believed somewhere deep and unexamined that love and generosity were only reasonable if they came with a return. If they made sense financially, socially, reputationally. He had never once given something away without calculating what it cost him. And this man, this mechanic sitting in a plastic hospital chair in work clothes, had torn a strip from his only jacket for a stranger with no contract, no guarantee, no angle. "Pastor Reynolds was one of the cars that passed me," James said abruptly. Marcus didn't react. "Did you know that?" James pressed. "I didn't know his name," Marcus said. "But I'm not surprised. It doesn't anger you, a man who preaches about this exact story, who has given sermons on the Good Samaritan, drove past you when you were helping a dying man." "It would have angered me once," Marcus said honestly. "Now it just makes me sad. Because I think he believes the story. I think he knows it by heart. But knowing a story and letting a story change you, those are two completely different things." James felt that land somewhere specific, somewhere painful, because he realized in that moment that he was not so different from Pastor Reynolds. He had believed in generosity as a concept. He had funded it, branded. It attached his name to it. He had made himself feel generous without ever actually being inconvenienced by anyone else's need. He had known the story too. He had just never let it change him. "What do you want?" James asked suddenly. "From me, from this conversation. What is it that you actually want?" Marcus looked at him steadily. "Nothing," he said. "I came because Daniel said you needed to put a face to what happened, so now you have one." He stood. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Anderson." He moved toward the door, and James said, "Wait." Marcus stopped. "I've had 263 contacts in my phone for 15 years, James said. "And when I woke up in this room, there was not one flower on that windowsill, not one person in that chair." His voice was controlled, but only just. "I built everything I was supposed to build, and I woke up alone." Marcus turned around. "What does that tell me?" James asked. Not rhetorically, like a man who had finally run out of his own answers and was asking someone else in genuine desperation. Marcus walked back toward him, slowly, and he looked at James Anderson with an expression of such clear, uncomplicated compassion that James felt the burning behind his eyes return stronger this time, and this time he didn't stop it. "It tells you," Marcus said quietly, "that you've been building the wrong things." And that was the moment the wall came down, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. James Anderson, 54 years old, more money than he could spend a name on the side of a building, sat back down in that chair and pressed his hand over his mouth and breathed through something that had been locked inside him for 30 years. Marcus sat back down too. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He just stayed the same way he had stayed on that highway, not because it was convenient, not because he had been asked, but because a person needed someone present, and he was present, and that was reason enough. And for the second time in 1 week, Marcus Williams saved James Anderson's life. The first time with a strip of jacket and a first aid kit. This time with 2 words and the willingness to stay. James Anderson was discharged from the hospital on a Friday morning, and the first thing he did was not call his assistant. He did not check his email. He did not call his lawyer or his financial advisor or any of the 263 people in his contact list. He sat in the back seat of a cab, not a car service, just a regular cab, and he looked out the window at Phoenix moving past him, and he thought about 2 words. Wrong things. Marcus had said it simply, without cruelty, without judgment. You've been building the wrong things. And the reason it had broken through every defense James Anderson had spent 30 years constructing was precisely because it hadn't been delivered as an attack. It had been delivered as a fact. The same way Marcus had said he's bleeding on that highway, not dramatic, not accusatory, just true. James had built a company worth $40 million. He had a home with 6 bedrooms. He had a name that opened doors in 3 states. And he had woken up in a hospital room with empty chairs and no flowers and a phone full of contacts who sent obligatory texts. He had been building things that looked like a life from a distance and felt like a waiting room up close. The cab stopped at his house, and James paid the driver and stood outside for a moment before going in. He looked at the front door, the expensive door, the one he'd had imported, the one a designer had chosen, and it occurred to him that he could not remember the last time coming home had felt like anything other than continuing to be alone in a different room. He went inside. He sat down. And he did something he had not done in years. He prayed. Not the polished public kind of prayer he had offered at charity dinners when someone asked him to say a few words. Not the performance of faith he had maintained in social settings. He sat in his living room alone, and he spoke out loud to God with the same rawness he had felt in that hospital chair when the wall came down messy, uncertain, without a prepared conclusion. He said, "I don't know how to do this differently. I don't even know what differently looks like, but I know what I've been doing hasn't worked. And I know that a man with nothing stopped for me when men with everything kept driving. And I think that means something. I think that's you trying to tell me something I've been too busy to hear." He stopped talking. The room was quiet. And then, slowly, something settled in him. Not an answer. Not a plan. Just a direction. The faint but unmistakable sense that a door had been opened, and all he had to do was be willing to walk through it. He picked up his phone and called his son. His son, 23 years old in his last year of graduate school in Seattle, polite. In the obligatory way that children become when a parent has kept them at arm's length for too long, answered after 2 rings. "Dad, is everything okay?" "I was in an accident," James said. "I'm fine, but I wanted to call you." A pause. "When?" "Earlier this week." Another pause, longer this time, and James could feel his son doing the math. "Earlier this week, and you're calling now and choosing whether to say it out loud." "Why didn't you call me sooner?" his son asked. His voice was careful, controlled, the voice of someone who had learned to manage disappointment quietly. "Because I didn't think I deserved to," James said. Silence. "Dad?" "I'm not saying that to manipulate you," James said quickly. "I'm saying it because it's the first honest answer I've had to anything in a long time. I didn't call you because I've spent 20 years teaching you that I don't need people. And I believed it so completely that even when I was lying in a hospital bed, I defaulted to proving it." His son didn't respond immediately. James could hear him breathing. "Are you really okay?" his son asked finally. And this time the careful control was gone. It was just a young man asking about his father. "No," James said. "Not yet, but I think I'm going to be." They talked for 40 minutes. It was not a perfect conversation. There were long silences, and a few moments where old patterns surfaced and had to be consciously set aside. But it was real in a way their conversations had not been in years, maybe ever. And when they hung up, James sat with his phone in his hand and felt something unfamiliar in his chest. It took him a moment to identify it. It was hope. Not optimism he had always had that the businessman's relentless forward projection. This was different. Hope was smaller and more specific and more frightening than optimism. Hope meant something mattered enough to lose. He hadn't felt that in a very long time. The following week, James did something that his colleagues would later describe as either a breakdown or a breakthrough, depending on who was telling the story. He called a meeting with his executive team and told them he was restructuring his role in the company. He was stepping back from day-to-day operations. He was not selling, not retiring, but he was stopping, deliberately. For the first time in 30 years, he was going to stop moving long enough to figure out what the movement had been for. His chief operating officer stared at him across the conference table. "James, are you serious?" "I'm more serious right now than I've been about anything in a decade," James said. "What triggered this?" James thought about how to answer that. He thought about Highway 85, about Marcus Williams with his torn jacket and his first aid kit, about Daniel Carter and his 4 seconds of hesitation, about the hospital room and the empty chairs. "A mechanic," he said. His COO blinked. "I'm sorry. A mechanic showed me something I had stopped being able to see," James said. "I'm not going to be able to explain it in a way that makes business sense, but I'm done making decisions that only make business sense." The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms get quiet when people don't know if their boss is having a crisis or a revelation and are afraid to guess wrong. James didn't help them figure it out. He just ended the meeting. But that was not the moment that changed everything. That came 3 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon, when James Anderson drove himself to Sullivan's Auto on the east side of Phoenix and walked in without calling ahead. Marcus was at the front counter this time, working on paperwork. He looked up when James walked in, and his expression was exactly what James had come to expect from him. No performance, no surprise, just steady acknowledgement. "Mr. Anderson," he said, "I told you to call me James." "Old habit," Marcus said. "Everything okay?" "I need to ask you something," James said. "And I need you to answer me honestly, not graciously. Can you do that?" Marcus studied him for a moment. "I can try. I want to do something," James said. "For you. Not as payment, I know you don't want that. But I've been thinking about what you said, about building the wrong things. And I've been thinking about what it means to actually change direction after 50 years of going the wrong way." He paused. "And I think the first thing a person has to do when they change direction is walk back toward the people they should have been walking toward all along." Marcus was very still. "I have resources," James continued. "I have connections. I have things that could actually make a difference in someone's life, and I have spent my whole career using them to make my own life more comfortable. I want to do something different. I want to start somewhere real, and I don't know where that is." He looked directly at Marcus. "But I think you might." The silence stretched between them, and then Marcus said something that James had not anticipated. "You really want to know?" "Yes? Then stop trying to fix things from the top," Marcus said. "Stop writing checks to buildings that get your name on them. Stop funding programs designed by people who have never been in the situations they're designing for." He leaned forward slightly. "You want to build something that matters. Start with people, specific people. The guy who can't make rent because his hours got cut. The woman who needs a car to get to work but can't get a loan because of her credit score. The kid who aged out of foster care with no one to call. They're not causes, they're people. And they don't need a program. They need someone to stop." Cheesy. James listened with his same focused silence he used to reserve for earnings reports and acquisition targets. Except this time, there was nothing to gain from it. This time, he was just listening. "That's what you do," James said. "You stop." "Every time I can," Marcus said. "How long have you been doing this?" Marcus almost smiled. "Long as I can remember. Didn't always have much to stop with. But I stopped anyway." James looked at him for a long moment, and then he said something he had never said to a business partner, a colleague, a family member, or a friend in 30 years of professional life. "I need help," he said. "Real help. Not the kind I pay for. The kind that comes from someone who actually knows what they're doing. Marcus looked at him. "I'm a mechanic," he said. "You're the most competent person I've met in a decade," James said. The title doesn't matter. Another silence. And this one felt different from the others. This one had weight in it, the specific weight of a decision being made of a person deciding whether to trust something that had not historically been trustworthy. "I'm not interested in being a project," Marcus said carefully. "I'm not interested in having one," James said. "I'm interested in learning from someone who already figured out what I'm trying to figure out." Marcus looked at the paperwork on the counter. He looked at the shop behind him. The cars, the work, the life he had built, in the specific and modest terms that the world had made available to him. And then he looked back at James Anderson. "You'd have to actually show up," Marcus said. "Not send someone, not fund something from a distance. You." "I know," James said. "And you'd have to listen more than you talk." "I'm working on that." Marcus was quiet for another moment. And then something shifted in his face, not dramatically, not sentimentally, but genuinely. The way a door opens when someone finally knocks the right way. "Come back Saturday morning," Marcus said. 7 a.m. There's a family on Garfield that's been trying to keep their heat on all winter. Father's been out of work. I've been going over on weekends. You can come." James nodded. "Bring coffee," Marcus added. "Real coffee, not the expensive stuff, just hot." And for the first time since waking up in that hospital room, James Anderson laughed, a real laugh, surprised and slightly embarrassed and completely unguarded. 7 a.m., he said. 7 a.m., Marcus confirmed. James turned to leave, and then he stopped at the door the same way Marcus had stopped at the hospital room door, and he turned back. "Marcus," he said. "Yeah, I asked you that day in the hospital what you wanted from me, and you said nothing." James paused. "I understand now why you said that, but I want you to know I am going to be a different man because of what you did on that highway. Not because I feel like I owe you, because you showed me something I had no right to expect from a stranger." He stopped. His voice was steady, but only just. "And I don't take that lightly." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "Good," he said simply. "Then don't." James walked out, and Marcus Williams went back to his paperwork. Same shop, same counter, same life, in all its modest and sufficient terms. But something had shifted in the room, because what had begun on a dark highway with a torn jacket and a first aid kit had become something neither man had planned for, and both of them needed. Not a transaction, not a debt repaid, not even a friendship yet, though it would become one. Something simpler than any of those things. Two people from completely different worlds deciding to walk in the same direction. And on Saturday morning at exactly 7 a.m., a 54-year-old businessman showed up on Garfield Street with 2 cups of coffee. Not the expensive kind, just hot, and stood beside a mechanic on a stranger's porch, and knocked on the door. The door on Garfield Street opened, and a woman named Rosa Mendez looked out at 2 men she had never seen before. One in work clothes, one in a jacket that was clearly too nice for a Saturday morning in this neighborhood, and her first instinct was to close it again. "Marcus?" she said, looking past James at the familiar face. "Morning, Rosa," Marcus said. "Brought someone with me today. He's okay." Rosa looked at James with the specific wariness of someone who had learned that people who showed up offering things usually wanted something back. She was in her mid-40s, tired, in the way that isn't fixed by sleep, and she held the door with one hand and said nothing. James held out the coffee. "I was told to bring hot," he said. "Not expensive, just hot." Rosa looked at the cup, then at Marcus. Marcus gave a small nod that said, "Trust it," and Rosa took the coffee and stepped aside to let them in. What James saw inside that house was not what he expected. He didn't know exactly what he had expected, something that confirmed his assumptions about what poverty looked like. Probably. Instead, he found a home. A real one. A place where someone had worked hard to make something dignified out of limited resources. A photo of a family on the wall, children's drawings taped up with care, a kitchen that smelled like someone had been cooking since early morning. Rosa's husband Carlos was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of him. He was a big man with tired eyes and hands that looked like they belonged on a job site. He stood when they walked in and looked at James with the same careful assessment Rosa had offered at the door. "This is James," Marcus said. "He's learning." Carlos studied James for a moment. Then he nodded once the way men nod when they decide to give something a chance, but reserve the right to change their mind, and said, "You want coffee? We have real coffee." James almost smiled at the echo of Marcus's words. "I'm good," he said. "Thank you." They sat down together, all four of them, and Marcus asked Carlos to walk them through what was happening. Carlos did it the way proud men discuss hard things directly, without self-pity, but with a careful economy of words that suggested he had told the story before, and hated every time. He had been a construction foreman for 11 years. His company had downsized 4 months ago. He had been looking for work every single day since, but the market was tight and he was 51, and certain employers looked at his age the way other employers looked at his name. The heating unit had failed in December. They had been managing with space heaters. The repair estimate was $1,100. He had applied for 3 assistance programs. 2 had wait lists. 1 had denied him on a technicality. He said all of this without asking for anything. He said it the way a man gives a status report accounting for facts, not pleading for rescue. James listened, and he did something that had not come naturally to him in 30 years of boardroom conditioning. He did not immediately begin solving. He did not pull out his phone to call a contractor. He did not reach for his wallet or begin structuring a solution. He just sat there and listened to the full weight of what this family had been carrying, and he let it actually reach him. That was the thing Marcus had said. Stop trying to fix things from the top. Stop designing solutions for people who aren't in the room. Just be in the room. So James was in the room. And when Carlos finished, James said, "How old are your kids?" Carlos blinked. It was clearly not the question he had anticipated. 9 and 12, he said. "What does your 12-year-old want to do when he grows up?" Carlos looked at his wife. Something passed between them, surprise, and then something softer. "Engineer," Carlos said. "He's always taking things apart. Drives Rosa crazy." "He sounds like he'd get along with Marcus," James said. Marcus from across the table said nothing, but his expression shifted slightly the way it did when something landed true. And then James said, "Carlos, I'm not going to write you a check today. I want to be straightforward about that because I know that's what it might look like when someone like me shows up." He paused. "But I do have a call I can make Monday morning to a construction company that owes me a favor. And I want to make it, not to fix everything, just to open one door. What you do with it is yours." Carlos was quiet for a long moment. "Why?" he said finally. The same question that James himself had asked Marcus in the hospital room. The same question that seemed to surface every time someone acted without an obvious angle. "Because someone stopped for me," James said. "When I was the man who needed stopping for. And I'm trying to figure out what that means, what it actually obligates me to do, not from a distance, not with a check, but with my actual presence and my actual time." Carlos looked at Marcus. "He's okay," Marcus said again. And Carlos nodded. This time it was a different nod, not the provisional one from earlier. This one meant something more. They stayed for 2 hours. James helped Carlos organize the paperwork for the third assistance program, the one that had denied him on a technicality, and identified a resubmission pathway that Carlos hadn't known existed. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of help that made a good story. It was just 2 men at a kitchen table with a stack of forms and a shared determination to find the door that was still open. When they left, Rosa walked them out. At the door, she looked at James with an expression that had changed entirely from the one she had worn when she opened it. "You should come back," she said. James looked at her. "I will," he said, and he meant it in a way he would not have been capable of meaning anything 3 weeks ago. In the truck afterward, Marcus's truck, old and reliable, and covered in the evidence of a working life, neither of them spoke for a while. James looked out the window at the neighborhood moving past and he was thinking, not planning, not strategizing, just thinking the way a person thinks when something real has happened to them and they are still in the middle of understanding it. "How long has Carlos been coming to your church?" James asked suddenly. Marcus glanced over at him. "Who said anything about church?" "The cross on the wall," James said. "Same design as the one at Grace Fellowship on 7th. A pause. 3 years, Marcus said. James processed that. His pastor knows what he's going through. Marcus was quiet for a moment too long. "Marcus." "His pastor knows," Marcus said carefully. And he sent a meal in January. Marcus kept his eyes on the road. Once. The inside of the truck went very still. James turned and looked at Marcus's profile. "Does that name happen to be Reynolds?" he asked. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. James faced forward again. He stared through the windshield at Phoenix moving past him, the city he had lived in for 25 years, the city he had built things in and driven through and never actually seen. And he felt something that was not anger, not quite, but was adjacent to it. Something that demanded to be looked at honestly. 2 men with status and position and the explicit professional responsibility to care. Pastor Reynolds, Dr. Miller had driven past the need directly in front of them, not because they were evil, not because they didn't believe what they preached, but because they had made their faith into something that lived in buildings and programs and scheduled hours. Something that operated at a safe distance from inconvenience, and a mechanic, a man, the world had consistently underestimated, underpaid, and driven past, had been living the thing they were only describing. "Can I ask you something personal?" James said. "You can ask," Marcus said. "Do you ever get tired of it being the one who stops while everyone else keeps going? Don't you ever want someone to stop for you?" Marcus was quiet for long enough that James thought he wasn't going to answer. Then Marcus said, "Yeah, I do." James looked at him. "I got sick 2 years ago," Marcus said. "Nothing catastrophic, but bad enough that I couldn't work for 6 weeks. And I found out real fast how many people in my life were there because of what I did for them versus who I was to them." He paused. It was a short list. "What did you do?" "I got through it," Marcus said simply. "And I came out the other side knowing 2 things. One, I was still going to stop for people, because that's who I am, not what I get back from it." He glanced over at James briefly. "And 2, I needed to stop being so proud about letting people stop for me." James stared at him. "That's what you've been doing?" James said slowly. "Letting me stop for you." Marcus gave a small half-smile. "Maybe I've been practicing what I preach too." And James Anderson felt something complete in his chest, like a circle closing, like the last piece of something important sliding into the place it had always been meant to occupy. Because he had come into this thinking he was the one learning from Marcus, the student Marcus the teacher, the broken man Marcus the whole one. But Marcus was not whole in the way James had romanticized. He had been left too. He had been sick and alone, and held together by the same quiet faith that sent him to torn-jacket strangers on dark highways. He was not a symbol. He was a man, complicated and tired and stubborn, and genuinely uncomplicatedly good in the specific way that goodness looks when it has been chosen repeatedly against the evidence. That was the thing Jesus had been saying all along. The Good Samaritan in the parable was not a perfect man. He was not a religious man. He was not the man the audience expected to be the hero. He was the man they had decided in advance was not worth listening to. And Jesus chose him specifically, deliberately chose him to be the one who showed what love actually looks like when it leaves the building. Not love as a concept, not love as a check written to a cause, not love performed for an audience. Love as a person who stops, who kneels down, who tears his own jacket, who stays until the ambulance comes, and then gets back in his truck and drives away without leaving his name. That was the answer to Ethan Parker's question. That was the answer to the lawyer's question in Luke 10. That was the answer to every question James Anderson had been too busy to ask for 30 years. Who is my neighbor? The question was never about geography. It was never about eligibility. It was never about who deserves the inconvenience of your attention. The question was always about direction. Are you moving toward people or away from them? Are you crossing the road or staying on your side? Are you calculating who qualifies, or are you simply responding to what is in front of you? The Samaritan didn't ask if the man on the road deserved his help. He asked what the man on the road needed. And then he provided it. With his hands, with his oil and his wine, with his own animal, with his money, with his time, with his presence. Full presence. Unglamorous, unwitnessed, unrecognized. That was the whole story. That had always been the whole story. And 3 months after a cold Tuesday night on Highway 85, Something remarkable and completely unspectacular was happening in Phoenix, Arizona. A construction worker named Daniel Carter had started mentoring two young men from a community program, not because anyone asked him to, but because a night on a highway had reminded him that stopping was something he was actually capable of. A businessman named James Anderson had made 17 phone calls that resulted in 4 job placements, including one for Carlos Mendez, who started as a site supervisor for a mid-sized contractor in March and came home that first Friday to find his heating unit repaired, paid for quietly without attribution, by a man who was finally learning that the most powerful thing generosity could do was disappear. And a mechanic named Marcus Williams kept doing exactly what he had always done. He went to work, he fixed things, he showed up on Saturday mornings, he brought what he had. He stayed as long as he was needed. He did not receive a community award. He was not featured in a news story. His name was not put on a building. But somewhere in Phoenix there were people who were warmer because he had stopped. People who had jobs because he had pointed someone in the right direction. People who had sat across from him at a kitchen table and experienced, maybe for the first time in years, what it felt like to have a person genuinely, unhurriedly present with them. And that not the building with the name on it, not the check, not the polished speech at the charity dinner that was the thing Jesus was talking about. That was what the parable had always been pointing toward. Not a lesson to be learned, a life to be lived, not an answer to be studied, a direction to be chosen. Every day, in every ordinary moment, on every road where someone has been left. The question was never, who is my neighbor? The question has always been, and will always be, this: will you be one? The road is still in front of you. Someone is waiting on the side of it right now. Not metaphorically, not in a parable. In your city, on your street, in your office, in your family, in the next conversation you have with someone who is holding more than they are showing. And you have exactly what Marcus Williams had on that highway: the choice to stop. Go and do likewise.